A Nation Divided, Unit 1, Notes number 5. Today we'll be looking at the issues that led up to the start of the Civil War. Plantation Economy. Southern states staked their livelihood on specializing in cash crops like tobacco, rice, indigo, and cotton. These crops could make a lot of money for the plantation, but they were also very labor intensive. So it required a huge force to plant, harvest, and pick these crops. To meet their labor needs, plantation owners turned to the use of African slaves when enslaved Native Americans and indentured servants failed. When colonists tried to enslave Native Americans, they knew the land very well and they could escape very easily. And indentured servants became very costly because you had to pay for their transportation to America, house them, feed them, and they're only yours for a specific amount of time. So African slaves became the preferred labor force for southern plantations. Most slaves, about 80 to 90% of them, would work in the fields. The other 10 to 20% would work in the house of their owner or as an artisan. So sometimes their owners would teach them a craft or a trade like carpentry, blacksmithing, bricklaying, in order to have them fulfill needs across the plantation. Slaves led a hard life. Full time work began at the age of 12 and continued until they died. So they worked their entire lives, usually from sunrise to sunset, with very little breaks in between. Slaves who were thought to be disobedient or disrespectful were whipped and beat. And so it was not a desirable life at all. It was not something that people went into willingly. Very harsh conditions. And so, of course, many people outside of the South looked down upon this type of labor force. And so, for the South, because their plantation economy surrounded around enslaved labor to make these crops profitable, they didn't know how they could function without it. The fight over slavery. Those in favor of slavery argued that it benefited blacks by making them a part of a prosperous and Christian civilization. They often cited the Bible to defend slavery. Slave owners invented the myth of a happy slave. They compared them to free blacks in the North that worked for low wages and felt that their slaves were actually happier than free blacks in the North. Southerners argued that plantations would care for their slaves for their entire lifetime, where free blacks in the North would be fired from their jobs when they got older. The abolition movement called for slavery to be outlawed, believing it to be a great national sin. By 1820, there were over 100 anti-slavery societies, and at this point, other Western civilizations had also began to outlaw slavery, whether it was in Great Britain or France. Abolitionists campaigned Congress for emancipation, for the freeing of slaves. They felt that this was something that our country needed to do. However, Southern representatives passed a rule to prevent debate on the subject. So they didn't even want it to be discussed in Congress, which meant that you couldn't debate or form a law for it to actually happen. So the turmoil over slavery would lead to a divided nation. You had those in the South that were in favor of it because their whole economy revolved around that. You had people in the North that saw it as a great moral sin that we as a country should not do this. And so these, people were either pro-slavery or they were against slavery. The Underground Railroad. Under the Fugitive Slave Act, alleged fugitives were not entitled to a public trial by jury. If someone accused them of being a fugitive slave, that's all that they needed to say. They were taken away. The fugitives could also not testify on their own behalf. Some Northerners began resisting the law and forming vigilance committees to send endangered African Americans to Canada. 9 northern states passed personal liberty laws which forbade the imprisonment of runaway slaves. So you have the South working to create legislation like the Fugitive Slave Act to return slaves that run away. And then you have states in the North that are trying to create laws to allow those that have escaped to continue to freedom. The Underground Railroad was a secret network of people who would aid fugitive slaves in their escape. Conductors were people who hid fugitives and would escort them to the next station. So it was a whole network going from town to town. Those that were escaping would travel by night, at nighttime, under the cover of darkness, going to one house and then traveling the next night to another safe house. Oftentimes, these safe houses had, hidden cabinets, places for them to stay during the day, so that they could not be discovered. The most famous conductor was Harriet Tubman. She made 19 trips and helped 300 slaves flee to freedom, including her own parents. So let's stop and think. What risks were involved in being a conductor or traveler of the Underground Railroad? So we have here a map showing, states in the South where slaves were escaping. Most of the time, they were trying to escape to Canada. So you see many of their routes would lead them to, Michigan, where they can cross over Lake Erie or Lake Ontario. But if they were caught, they risked being arrested, having fines, or worse, being killed. So whether it was the traveler, the runaway slave, or even the people who were the conductors traveling with them, or the people that were hiding them in their homes, all of these people had put up great risks to allow this to happen. Uncle Tom's Cabin. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin. She was an ardent abolitionist. The book delivered a message that slavery was not a political contest, but a great moral struggle. This book became a bestseller, and it really helped to influence people's opinion against slavery. As a result, Northern abolitionists increased their protest of the Fugitive Slave Act, and Southerners saw the book as an attack on the South as a whole. The Dred Scott Decision. Dred Scott was a slave who decided to sue for his freedom on the basis that his owner took him to live in a free territory. In 1857, the Supreme Court ruled that slaves did not have the rights of citizens, basically saying that they are property. So it's like, how can your couch sue? Your couch is property. And so that is basically what they're equating slaves to be. The court also said that Congress could not forbid slavery because that would interfere with an owner's right to own property. This decision cleared the way for an extension of slavery. So if Congress can't forbid it, then slavery would just be able to continue. So the election of 1860. So the election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln ran as a Republican. There were also two Democratic candidates, one from the South, one from the North. So pictured here is Stephen Douglas. He was the Northern Democratic candidate. And so him and Lincoln had these famous Lincoln-Douglas debates where they're trying to convince people to vote for him. So if you look at the electoral map, Abraham Lincoln, he won the election, even without receiving any electoral votes from the South. So you see in the South, they're all this mustardy color for J.C. Breckinridge. And in some Southern states, Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot. So Lincoln's victory convinced the South that they've lost their political voice. They felt that Northern views, abolitionist views, were going to influence Congress, and it was just inevitable before slavery would be abolished. Fearful that Northern Republicans would submit to the South the most complete subjection of and political bondage, some Southern states decided to act. South Carolina led the way, seceding from the Union on December 20th, 1860. So to secede means to leave. So the South said, we no longer want to be a part of the United States of America. We are leaving. We are seceding. For many in the South, the cry of states' rights meant the complete independence of Southern states from federal government control. And so when people talk about the cause of the Civil War. Many people will say it's obviously about slavery. The North wanted to abolish it, the South wanted to keep it. Some people will argue that it's about states' rights, but it's about a state's right to have slavery and not have that being taken away from them by the federal government. On February 4th, 1861, the Confederate States of America was formed. On April 12th, 1861, the Confederates fire on Fort Sumter, starting the Civil War. Many Americans believed that the war would end quickly. However, it lasted 4 long years. So let's stop and think. Which side should have the advantage in the war? So this little image gives you a few pie charts and diagrams to show that in most cases, the North had the advantage. They had military strength of more naval ships, iron production, firearms. They had a larger population. So, by all accounts, they should have been able to win the war very quickly. However, the South was fighting for, in their words, in their beliefs, their way of life. So that caused them to be more passionate in their fighting. So just like when you think about the American Revolution, how could the American militia that was just kind of put together, defeat the Great Britain's army that was well trained, but the Americans had much more to fight for. So you can kind of compare those two together. Emancipation Proclamation. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation. The proclamation did not free any slaves immediately because it only applied to areas behind Confederate lines. The proclamation was a military action only aimed at states in rebellion. So, although the proclamation did not have much practical effect, it had immense symbolic importance. For many, it gave the war a high moral purpose of what they were fighting for, what the war was about. Free blacks welcomed the section of the proclamation that allowed them to enlist in the Union Army, so they wanted to fight. The Confederates reacted to the proclamation with outrage. They knew that once this was issued, that a compromise was no longer an option. End of war. By late March 1865, it was clear that the end of the Confederacy was near. On April 2nd, the Confederate president and his government abandoned their capital in Virginia. The official Confederate surrender was complete on April 9th, 1865, in Appomattox. The Union General Ulysses S. Grant and Confederate General Robert E. Lee met to sign the terms. Within 2 months, all Confederate resistance would be collapsed. So we're done with the notes today. Next week, we will be looking at Reconstruction. So now the war is over, the North has won, but what happens next? So we'll be looking at that next week.